There are figures in history whose lives seem to have been written by starlight, their destinies unfolding with the grand, sweeping certainty of a beloved epic. They are the heroes and heroines of our collective memory, the charismatic monarchs, the celebrated beauties, the defiant revolutionaries, whose stories resonate with triumph, passion, and a profound sense of purpose. We are drawn to these narratives because they affirm our deepest hopes, that love can conquer all, that courage will be rewarded, and that a single brilliant life can illuminate the world. These are the stories that feel like fairy tales made real, even if only for a fleeting moment. But history is not a fairy tale. For every life lived in the brilliant glare of the sun, there is another lived in the persistent, encroaching shadows. In the very same gilded palaces, under the weight of the very same crowns, other stories unfold, quieter, dissonant, and steeped in a sorrow that no amount of privilege can assuage. These are the narratives of the misplaced souls, the men and women born into roles for which they were fundamentally unsuited, like actors thrust onto a stage without a script, wearing a costume that doesn't fit. Theirs are not stories of dramatic public tragedy, but of a slow internal unraveling, a lifelong struggle against the very circumstances that were meant to define them. Today we journey deep into one of history's most poignant and forgotten shadow lives. It is the story of a woman who was born a princess and destined to be a queen, yet who seemed to possess none of the instincts or desires for either role. She was Princess Elisabeth of Romania, a figure of classical, almost unnerving beauty, who moved through the opulent courts of early 20th century Europe like a phantom, an observer trapped inside the body of a participant. Her life was not a singular, shattering catastrophe, but a long, slow accumulation of disillusionment, a symphony played perpetually in a minor key. She was a woman who seemed to have been born into a state of profound internal exile, long before political turmoil would make that exile a grim physical reality. Join us as we uncover the deeply human, intensely private, and ultimately tragic life of Elisabeth, a princess who was given everything the world could offer, except for the one thing that truly mattered, the capacity for happiness. To truly comprehend the enigmatic and guarded woman Elisabeth would become, we must first step into the very specific world that created her. Her story begins on the 12th of October, 1894, not in a bustling ancient capital, but in a setting that was itself a kind of fantasy, the breathtaking Peleș Castle in Sinaia, Romania. This was no grim medieval fortress. It was a fairy tale confection of German neo-Renaissance architecture, a symphony of turrets, timber frames, and intricate carvings nestled amidst the misty, pine-scented grandeur of the Carpathian Mountains. The castle was a potent symbol of the Romanian monarchy itself, new, ambitious, deeply Germanic in its origins, yet striving to create a uniquely Romanian identity. This tension between its German roots and its Balkan reality was the same tension that would come to define Elisabeth's own life. The court she was born into was still under the long shadow of her great-uncle, King Carol I. He was the man who had essentially founded the modern Romanian state, a stern, disciplined, and militaristic German prince who had been invited to rule in 1866. His court was a place of rigid protocol, ironclad routine, and an almost Spartan sense of duty. He had forged a nation through discipline, and he expected his family to reflect that same unyielding seriousness. It was into this formal, demanding world that his nephew, the quiet and bookish Ferdinand, was brought as the heir. Ferdinand was a man of quiet, scholarly integrity, more at home in a library or a botanical garden than in the cut and thrust of Balkan politics. Plagued by a natural timidity, he was a gentle soul in a position that demanded iron, and he lived in constant dutiful awe of his formidable uncle. If Ferdinand was the quiet, fertile earth of this new Romanian dynasty, his wife, Crown Princess Marie, was its blazing, untamable sun. Born Marie of Edinburgh, she was a woman who seemed to embody the very essence of royalty in its most dazzling form. A granddaughter of both Queen Victoria and Tsar Alexander II, her lineage was a map of 19th century power. But Marie was far more than just her bloodline. She was a force of nature, passionate, fiercely intelligent, artistic, and possessed of a radiant beauty that captivated all who met her. Where Ferdinand was hesitant, she was bold. Where he was private, she was a masterful public performer. She was a brilliant horsewoman who rode with a fearless, almost reckless abandon, a talented writer whose diaries and memoirs offer an astonishingly candid glimpse into her world, and an artist with a keen eye for beauty. Above all, she was a woman who understood with innate genius the theater of monarchy. She embraced her role with a passion that bordered on religious fervor, transforming herself from an English princess into the iconic, almost mythical soul of Romania. She was brilliant, and she knew it. She shone, and she expected, even demanded, that her children orbit her as planets, reflecting her magnificent light. Into this dynamic, a family of quiet duty and dazzling charisma, Elisabeth was born, their second child and eldest daughter. From her earliest days, it was profoundly, almost unnervingly clear that she was cut from a different, colder cloth. Her older brother, Carol, the heir to the throne, was charming, willful, and precocious, a difficult child, but one whose passions were at least understandable. Her younger siblings, Marie, known as Mignon, who would become Queen of Yugoslavia, Nicholas or Nicky, and Ileana, were lively, affectionate, and sociable children who basked in their mother's warmth. But Elisabeth, known in the family as Elisabetha, was a puzzle. She was a quiet, withdrawn, and intensely serious child who seemed to exist in a world entirely of her own making, a world to which even her own family was rarely granted admission. Her own mother, a keen and often brutally honest observer, chronicled Elisabeth's perplexing nature in her private diaries, the pages filled with a mother's love, battling against a profound sense of bewilderment. Marie described her eldest daughter as possessing a strange, shut-in nature, a child who was shut away in a house of her own building, into which it was not always easy to penetrate. She noted Elisabeth's morbid love of the gruesome, a trait that baffled her life-affirming mother. While other children read fairy tales of princes and princesses, Elisabeth was fascinated by the lives of the Christian saints, particularly their grim and stoic martyrdoms. She was drawn to stories of tragedy and sacrifice, finding a strange comfort in their solemnity. This temperament was paired with a painfully, almost pathologically sensitive pride. While other children craved affection and cuddles, Elisabeth often recoiled from physical touch, holding the world at a careful, deliberate arm's length. She was possessed by what her mother termed a strong consciousness of what was right and what was wrong, an unyielding black and white view of the world that made her judgmental, unforgiving, and difficult to comfort. When she was hurt, she did not cry. She froze, retreating into a stony silence that was impenetrable, a wall of ice her mother's warmth could never seem to melt. Even her celebrated beauty was of a different, more intimidating kind than her mother's. While Marie's beauty was warm, vital, and expressive, Elisabeth's was that of a classical Greek statue, a perfect, symmetrical, marble-like beauty that was flawless to behold, but cold to the touch. Her features were noble, her posture impeccable, but her eyes, even as a child, seemed distant and melancholic, as if she were observing life from behind a sheet of invisible glass. Her great-uncle, the stern King Carol I, was said to be one of the few who understood her. He appreciated her seriousness and her innate sense of decorum, seeing in her a reflection of the Hohenzollern discipline he prized. He once remarked that Elisabeth is the only one who knows how to behave. For Elisabeth, his approval was likely a source of quiet validation, a sign that her nature was not a flaw, but a virtue, a belief that would put her in direct opposition to the vibrant, emotional world her mother was trying to build. Her childhood was, on the surface, an idyll. Life was a privileged rhythm between the fairy tale wonder of Palish Castle in the summers and the more formal Cotrocini Palace in Bucharest. Yet she seemed to derive little joy from the pageantry and privilege that surrounded her. She was an outsider within her own boisterous, affectionate family, a solitary shadow in the brilliant, sunlit tableau created by her mother. Queen Marie, a woman of immense energy who thrived on emotional connection, poured her affection and attention onto her more responsive children. She tried, with increasing frustration, to connect with her solemn, self-contained daughter, but found her efforts constantly rebuffed. She wrote of trying to embrace Elisabeth, only to feel her daughter's body stiffen in her arms. This failure to forge a deep, warm maternal bond would become one of the defining sorrows of Elisabeth's life, leaving a profound void that she would spend the rest of her years trying and failing to fill. It was a classic case of a narcissistic, albeit well-meaning mother being unable to comprehend a child so fundamentally different from herself. Marie needed an audience, and Elisabeth refused to be a spectator in her mother's drama. Like all princesses of her time, Elisabeth was educated by a string of governesses, becoming fluent in English, French, and German, in addition to her native Romanian. She developed a genuine talent for painting, often spending hours alone in her room, meticulously copying artworks with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. It was an act of control, of creating perfect, ordered worlds on paper that she could not find in the messy reality of her life. She was also a gifted pianist, able to lose herself in the structured mathematical melancholy of Bach and the profound sorrows of Chopin. But these were, crucially, solitary pursuits, activities that allowed her to remain within the safe, controlled fortress of her own inner world. They required no messy interaction, no unpredictable emotional exposure. Socially, she was a disaster. At children's parties, while her siblings and visiting cousins from Russia or Britain played boisterous games, Elisabeth could often be found in a corner observing the scene with a silent, critical eye. She found the easy chatter and casual friendships of her peers to be frivolous and baffling. This wasn't shyness, which can be overcome. It was a more profound, almost philosophical disconnect from the world around her. This was the great central paradox of her youth. She was a princess who found the very act of being a princess, the smiling, the charming, the constant public performance, to be an excruciating and utterly meaningless burden. She was being meticulously groomed for a life on the world's most public stage, but every fiber of her being, every instinct she possessed, screamed for a life of quiet, contemplative, and solitary retreat. This fundamental, irreconcilable conflict between her innate nature and her prescribed destiny was not just a challenge of her youth, it was the tragic flaw that would define and ultimately destroy her entire existence. As Elisabeth blossomed into a young woman of striking, if severe beauty, the question of her future became a pressing matter of state. For a princess of her impeccable rank, marriage was not a private affair of the heart. It was the ultimate diplomatic tool. In the intricate, high-stakes chess game of European dynastic politics in the early 20th century, she was an exceptionally valuable piece, a living currency to be used, to forge alliances, secure borders, and cement national interests. For her mother, the ever-ambitious and politically astute Queen Marie, finding a suitable high-ranking husband for her eldest daughter was not just a maternal duty, but a crucial strategic objective for the future of Greater Romania. The First World War had shattered the old world order. The great Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, which had for centuries dictated the fate of the Balkans, had crumbled to dust. In their wake, a new, dangerously volatile landscape emerged. Romania had emerged from the war as a greatly enlarged and influential kingdom, having doubled its territory. But it was a kingdom surrounded by potential enemies and ideological threats, most terrifyingly the specter of Bolshevism, now raging in Russia. Queen Marie, a first cousin of the murdered Tsar Nicholas II, understood this threat intimately. She envisioned a powerful bloc of stable, interconnected monarchies in southeastern Europe, a bulwark against the red tide. And the most logical, strategically vital partner in this vision was Romania's southern neighbor, the Kingdom of Greece. A marriage alliance, a double-braided cord of Romanian and Greek royalty, would create a formidable regional partnership. And so, a match was sought. The candidate chosen for Elisabeth was Crown Prince George of Greece, the eldest son of King Constantine I and Queen Sophia, who was herself a sister of Germany's deposed Kaiser Wilhelm II. On paper, the dynastic arithmetic was perfect. He was the heir to an ancient Orthodox throne. She was the daughter of a rising Orthodox power. But in the fragile human chemistry of personality, the pairing was a looming disaster. George was, in many ways, Elisabeth's male counterpart. He was not a dashing romantic hero from a novel. He was a serious, dutiful, and profoundly shy man, a chain smoker whose public appearances were often marked by a nervous, fidgety energy and a deeply melancholic expression. Burdened by the immense political turmoil that was the birthright of any Greek monarch, he had already spent a significant portion of his youth in exile after his father was first deposed in 1917 for his pro-German leanings. This experience had instilled in him a deep sense of caution, a pessimistic outlook, and the grim gravity of a man who has lost everything once and fears it could happen again. He was a man who understood duty, protocol, and suffering far better than he understood joy or passion. There was no whirlwind courtship, no exchange of lovelorn letters, no pretense of a passionate love match. This was a purely political arrangement, a cold, calculated transaction designed to bind two kingdoms together. The negotiations were conducted not between the young couple, but between their formidable mothers, Queen Marie of Romania and Queen Sophia of Greece. The first meeting between George and Elisabeth, arranged in Switzerland, was a case study in awkward formality. Faced with a man as silent and solemn as herself, Elisabeth made no effort to charm or engage. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. Yet, in a strange way, Elisabeth may have felt a flicker of relief. She had spent her life surrounded by her mother's theatrical charm and her brother's reckless charisma. Perhaps in George's sober gravity she mistakenly saw a kindred spirit, a fellow soul who understood the burden of their position, not realizing that his sadness stemmed from political anxiety, while hers was a more profound internal emptiness. She accepted her fate with a quiet, almost unnerving resignation. For her, this was not the beginning of a life shared with a soulmate. It was another solemn, unavoidable duty to be performed, like attending a state dinner or christening a ship. In a peculiar and ultimately ill-fated turn of dynastic events, the arrangement became a double pact. As Elisabeth was being pushed towards George, her rebellious and charismatic older brother, Crown Prince Carol of Romania, had fallen for George's younger sister, the gentle and sensitive Princess Helen of Greece. In a move that Queen Marie hoped would tie the two families and nations together with an unbreakable double knot, a dual engagement was announced. It was a grand strategic play, but one that ignored the volatile personalities of the players involved. The double wedding took place in March of 1921. Bucharest was en fête, the city decorated with the flags of both nations. But within the walls of the Metropolitan Cathedral, observers noted the strange, cold atmosphere surrounding one of the brides. The contrast between the two couples was stark and painful. Carol, ever the performer, was the dashing groom, smiling and attentive to his lovely, adoring bride, Helen. They at least gave the appearance of a fairy tale romance. But beside them, Elisabeth and George looked like figures from a tragedy. Accounts from the ceremony describe a princess who seemed distant, detached, and utterly impassive, a beautiful ice sculpture going through the motions. There was no warmth in her expression, no sign of joy, no hint of the nervous excitement of a young woman embarking on a new life. As she stood at the altar beside her equally solemn groom, they looked less like a couple in love and more like two prisoners of fate, resigned to their shared sentence. At the reception that followed, her mother, Queen Marie, was seen trying to gently coax a smile from her daughter for the photographers, only to be met with a blank, unyielding stare. It was a small but public moment of defeat for the charismatic queen, a sign that even her formidable will could not conjure happiness in her daughter. Their personalities, both so reserved, guarded, and introverted, did not complement or balance each other. They simply compounded the silence, creating a larger and more profound void between them. He was a quiet, insecure man who desperately needed a warm, vivacious, and supportive partner to draw him out of his shell. She was a self-contained, emotionally frozen woman who would have required a man of almost superhuman patience, warmth, and empathy to even begin to chip away at the formidable walls she had built around her heart. They were, in short, a catastrophic match. Two lonely souls locked together in a gilded cage of royal duty. Immediately after the wedding, Elisabeth had to face the terrifying upheaval of leaving her home and traveling to Greece. For a woman who thrived on solitude, familiarity, and routine, this was a profoundly destabilizing experience. And the Athens she arrived in was a nation in the throes of a deep and bitter crisis. The city was not a picturesque postcard of ancient ruins. It was a tense, chaotic capital, its streets filled with wounded soldiers returning from the front in Anatolia. The very air was thick with political anxiety. Greece was still deeply divided by the national schism, a virtual civil war of ideology between the supporters of the monarchy and the fervent republicans led by the charismatic statesman Eleftherios Venizelos. The royal palace was not the romantic mountain sanctuary of her youth. It was the nerve center of the royalist faction, a hotbed of political intrigue, military plots, and simmering resentment against the half of the country that wished them gone. Into this powder keg, Elisabeth arrived, and she made absolutely no effort to adapt. She viewed her new homeland with a mixture of fear and disdain. She found the Greek court, with its more relaxed, emotional, and boisterous Levantine manners, to be unsophisticated and chaotic compared to the formal Germanic-influenced court of Romania. She made only a cursory effort to learn the Greek language. A lady-in-waiting assigned to her tried to teach her simple greetings, only to be dismissed with an impatient wave of the hand. This was seen not as a personal failing, but as a calculated insult, a clear and public signal of her unwillingness to connect with her new country. She viewed her official duties, the hospital visits to wounded soldiers, the charity bazaars for war orphans, with unconcealed distaste. She would perform them with a rigid, icy correctness, but her body language screamed her misery, creating an aura of cold disapproval that chilled everyone she met. To the Greek royal family, particularly her stern Prussian-born mother-in-law, Queen Sophia, her behavior was an embarrassment. Sophia expected her to be a dutiful, supportive consort, and Elisabeth's sullen withdrawal was a dereliction of that duty. To the public, she came across as cold, arrogant, and breathtakingly snobbish. They saw a foreign princess who seemed to look down upon them, who remained entirely uninterested in their national plight at a time of immense suffering. She was a foreigner not just by birth, but by deliberate choice, wrapping herself in a cloak of icy indifference as a desperate defense against a world she found overwhelming and hostile. Her marriage was an immediate and obvious failure. Her new life was a daily misery. The stage was being meticulously set for a public and private catastrophe that would shatter what little remained of her fragile composure and send her spiraling into a darkness from which she would never truly emerge. The fragile, unstable world Elisabeth had reluctantly entered was about to completely and violently implode. The Greek campaign in Anatolia, which had begun with dreams of a revived Hellenic empire, had ended in a nightmare. In September of 1922, just over a year after her joyless and sterile wedding, the Greek army suffered a catastrophic and humiliating military defeat at the hands of the nationalist forces of Turkey, led by the brilliant and ruthless Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The Great Catastrophe, as it became forever known in Greek history, resulted in the burning of the vibrant port city of Smyrna and the forced, violent exodus of over 1 million ethnic Greeks from Anatolia, their families having lived there for centuries. The national trauma was immense, a raw, gaping wound of grief and humiliation. A scapegoat was needed, and the public's fury, expertly channeled by revolutionary officers, turned on the government and the monarchy. A military coup, led by Republican-leaning colonels Nikolaos Plastiras and Stylianos Gonatas, erupted. King Constantine I, whose pro-German stance had already led to his first exile, was squarely blamed for the disaster. He was seen as an inept leader who had led his nation to ruin. Under immense pressure from the Revolutionary Committee, which now held all the power, he was forced to abdicate for a second and final time to save the dynasty itself. The crown, now tarnished and almost worthless, passed to his eldest son. And so in the midst of national humiliation, political chaos, and the raw grief of a defeated nation, the deeply unhappy Crown Prince George and the utterly unprepared Elisabeth became King George II and Queen of the Hellenes. Their accession was not met with cheers or celebration, but with a tense, sullen silence. They were not seen as saviors, but as placeholders for a broken institution. For Elisabeth, this was not a moment of triumph or the fulfillment of destiny. It was the realization of her deepest fears, a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. The crown was not a symbol of glory, but a crown of thorns, pressing down on her with the full, unbearable weight of a nation's despair. The new reign began under the shadow of the executioner's rifle. The revolutionary government, in a brutal demonstration of its power, arrested 8 of the previous government's senior political and military leaders. In what became known as the infamous Trial of the Six, these men were summarily tried for high treason, and just a few weeks into George's reign, 6 of them were executed by firing squad. The new king was powerless to intervene, a monarch in name only, forced to stand by silently as his father's closest advisors were killed. The event sent a wave of terror through Athens and made George II's position terrifyingly clear. He was a hostage king, his throne entirely at the mercy of the military. Against this backdrop of fear and recrimination, Elizabeth was expected to be a source of comfort and stability. She was now the first lady of a country she actively disliked, the queen of a people she did not understand, and for whom she felt no genuine connection. Her first public appearances as queen became exercises in painful, awkward silence. At a memorial service for the war dead, she stood veiled and rigid, a statue of grief. When grieving mothers and widows were presented to her, she offered no word of comfort, no gesture of empathy, merely a blank, vacant stare before turning away. To the public, it was seen as proof of a heart of stone. To those who knew her, it was the visible sign of a spirit in complete paralysis. Photographs from this period are heartbreaking to behold. They show a woman with a haunted, vacant expression, her classical beauty a stark, unsmiling mask of misery, while her husband, overwhelmed by the political firestorm, spent his days in tense, fruitless meetings, trying to navigate the treacherous waters of the new government. Elizabeth simply withdrew into the cold fortress of her own misery. Her profound unhappiness was compounded by a series of devastating personal blows. She became pregnant in early 1923, a flicker of hope in the darkness. An heir would have been a powerful symbol of continuity, a potential anchor for the storm-tossed dynasty. But the pregnancy was fraught with complications. Living under constant stress in a state of perpetual anxiety, she suffered a devastating miscarriage. The loss was a deeply traumatic event that plunged her even further into a state of severe depression. It was not just a personal tragedy, but a dynastic one, another sign that fate had turned against them. She retreated to the relative quiet of Tatoi Palace, the royal family's country estate outside Athens, to recover. But there, in the silent, sun-drenched rooms, she found no peace, only a profound sense of emptiness. Attended by servants, but emotionally abandoned by a husband, too consumed by the crisis, and too emotionally closed off himself to offer her the comfort she so desperately needed. As if fate were determined to break her completely, shortly after the miscarriage, she contracted typhoid fever. In the 1920s, this was a severe and often fatal illness. For weeks, she was consumed by a raging fever, delirium, and excruciating pain. It was a near-death experience that left her physically emaciated and emotionally shattered for months. The illness, while genuine and severe, also provided her with a convenient and socially acceptable excuse to withdraw almost completely from public life. It allowed her to retreat into the isolation that she had always craved, but which was now layered with a thick blanket of genuine grief and physical suffering. She spent her days confined to her rooms in the palace, refusing to see visitors, taking no part in state affairs, and showing no interest in the political firestorm raging just outside her windows. She was a queen in name only, a ghost haunting the corridors of power while her husband struggled alone and unsupported to hold on to his crumbling throne. The reign of King George II was doomed from the start. The royalist government was weak and ineffective, and Republican sentiment, fueled by the military defeat and the ongoing refugee crisis that saw over 1 million desperate people flood into the country, was growing stronger by the day. The monarchy was increasingly seen as an expensive, foreign-imposed institution that had led the nation to ruin. The pressure from the Revolutionary Committee and the powerful military factions mounted relentlessly. Finally, just over a year after their accession, in December of 1923, the end came. King George II was summoned to a meeting with the leaders of the government. There was no negotiation. He was politely but firmly asked to leave Greece. It was cynically presented to the public as a temporary leave of absence until the political situation stabilized, a face-saving gesture to avoid creating a royalist martyr. But everyone involved, including George and Elizabeth, knew precisely what it was: an exile. Their departure from Athens was not a dramatic middle-of-the-night flight, but a quiet, deeply humiliating public retreat. The final hours in the palace were a somber, surreal affair of servants, packing trunks in hushed silence. They said their farewells to the few remaining loyalists, their faces grim. Then they were escorted to the train station. They boarded a special carriage, and as the train pulled away from the station, Elizabeth was leaving behind a life she had hated, but she was also leaving as a publicly acknowledged failure. The experience had stripped her of the one thing that had given her life its rigid structure and purpose, however unwanted that purpose had been. The long, silent train journey north was a rolling funeral procession for their reign, the two of them trapped together in a small compartment, surrounded by the wreckage of their shared failure. A few months later, in March of 1924, while they were living in a state of limbo in Romania, the Second Hellenic Republic was formally proclaimed. George and Elizabeth were officially deposed. Their reign had lasted a mere 15 months, one of the shortest in modern European history. At the age of just 30, Elizabeth was now a former queen, a royal refugee with no kingdom, no official role, and no discernible future, shackled by the bonds of a hollow marriage to a man she did not love, and who by now surely felt nothing but bitter resentment for the icy, unsupportive woman who had been his queen. Of course, I have developed the provided section with a greater depth of detail, exploring the psychological nuances, social dynamics, and personal moments of this period in Elizabeth's life. The new content is woven into the existing framework to create a seamless, more immersive narrative that adheres to all your stylistic requirements. The deposed king and queen sought refuge in the one place Elizabeth still considered home, her native Romania. They arrived in Bucharest not as triumphant visiting sovereigns, but as awkward and impoverished relations, the living embodiment of a failed dynastic project. Their return plunged them into a world of gilded dependency, entirely reliant on the hospitality and financial support of Elizabeth's family, particularly her mother, the now reigning Queen Marie. This was a situation that was deeply humiliating for both of them, but the nature of that humiliation was different for each. For George, it was a daily agony of emasculation. He was a king without a country, a man stripped of his purpose, forced to live in his wife's homeland as an awkward guest in a court where he held no power and commanded no influence. He was surrounded by the pageantry of monarchy, the uniforms, the protocol, the deference, but none of it was his. The Romanian court of the Roaring Twenties was a vibrant, glamorous place, a Paris of the East, where Queen Marie presided over glittering balls and artistic salons. George and Elizabeth, when they could be coaxed into attending, were like two specters at the feast, their grim, silent presence a stark contrast to the lively atmosphere. They would arrive, perform a few stiff greetings, and then retreat into a corner before making their excuses and leaving as early as possible. He was a proud, sensitive man, and the enforced idleness, the financial dependency on his mother-in-law, and the constant, unspoken pity of his in-laws gnawed at his soul. He spent his days in their Bucharest villa writing endless letters, his study filled with the constant haze of cigarette smoke. Secretive visitors would come and go, aging Greek colonels and earnest politicians, whispering of plots and counterplots. He was desperately, almost obsessively, plotting a return to his throne, a quest that was the only thing giving his life a semblance of meaning. For Elisabeth, returning to Romania should have been a source of comfort, a retreat to the familiar. Instead, it only served to starkly highlight the profound emptiness of her life. She was back in the world of her youth, but she was a profoundly changed woman. The accumulated trauma of her time in Greece, the loveless marriage, the political chaos, the terrifying responsibility of being queen, the miscarriage, the debilitating illness, and the final humiliation of exile had hardened her irrevocably. The defensive walls she had so carefully constructed around herself as a child were now reinforced with the thick, unyielding steel of genuine suffering and bitter resentment. She saw her experience not as a misfortune to be overcome, but as a deep personal betrayal by fate itself, and she carried that grievance like a shield. The marriage, which had been a cold political arrangement from the start, completely disintegrated under the strain of their dreary, aimless existence. They were given a wing in the Quattrocini Palace, and later moved into their own villa, but they lived almost entirely separate lives under the same roof. The cold silence that had always defined their relationship now deepened into a chasm of mutual antipathy. The few staff who worked for them spoke of a household where the master and mistress rarely spoke, communicating through intermediaries or not at all. A place where the air was thick with unspoken resentment. They rarely appeared in public together, and when they did, their stiff formality and obvious lack of affection were an open secret in the gossipy circles of European royalty. George traveled frequently, visiting London, Paris, and other European capitals, ostensibly to rally support for his cause, but also undoubtedly to escape the stifling atmosphere of his life in Bucharest and his funereal marriage. Elisabeth, meanwhile, remained in Romania, sinking ever deeper into a life of apathy and lethargy. She resumed her painting and her piano playing, but these were no longer creative outlets for a young princess. They were the monotonous, time-filling routines of a forgotten queen. She had no official role, no duties to perform, and her difficult personality meant she had cultivated few real friends. She had, in effect, become an exile within her own home, a ghost haunting the fringes of the vibrant Romanian court. Her relationship with her formidable mother, Queen Marie, remained as strained as ever. Marie, a woman of action and indefatigable optimism, was deeply frustrated by her daughter's crippling passivity. In one tense confrontation, Marie urged her daughter to at least play the part of the supportive wife for George, for the sake of appearances and the family's dignity. "Your duty is to stand by him," Marie insisted, seeing the situation as a political role to be performed. Elisabeth's reply was icy and dismissive. She had no interest in performance. She had tried it, and it had destroyed her. She resisted all her mother's efforts to draw her out, preferring the bleak, punishing comfort of her self-imposed isolation. This charade of a marriage, this slow, painful public unraveling, continued for over a decade. It was a long, silent goodbye, stretched out over years of shared addresses and separate lives. Finally, in 1935, the inevitable end came. It was George who initiated the proceedings. The political winds in Greece were shifting, and the possibility of his restoration was becoming more concrete. To return to the throne, he needed to be unencumbered by the dead weight of his unpopular, unwilling, and now estranged wife. They officially divorced. The process was handled quietly and discreetly, with incompatibility cited as the official reason. It was the final anticlimactic act in a story that had never contained a single spark of love or joy. The divorce marked the ultimate and final divergence of their paths. In a stunning and ironic twist of fate that must have felt like a cruel joke to Elisabeth, the Greek Republic faltered later that same year. A rigged plebiscite resulted in the restoration of the monarchy, and George II was invited back to reclaim his throne. His return to Athens was a moment of incredible political drama. Elisabeth could only watch from afar as the man whose life she had shared in misery for 14 years once again became a king. Her reaction was likely a complex cocktail of emotions: the sting of being the discarded wife, the profound relief of her own freedom, and perhaps a grim satisfaction in knowing she would never have to set foot in that country again. Elisabeth, however, was left behind, adrift. She was now officially nothing more than Princess Elisabeth of Romania, a divorcee, a footnote in her ex-husband's dramatic story. But with this final severing of ties, a strange and unexpected thing happened. For the first time in her adult life, she was in control of her own destiny. Using her own funds and a keen business sense that surprised many, she purchased the Grand Banloc estate, a vast agricultural domain in western Romania. There, she proved to be a shrewd and effective landowner, finding in the cold, hard facts of finance and estate management a welcome respite from the messy unpredictability of human emotions. Numbers did not lie. Crop yields did not disappoint you. She also commissioned a new modernist palace in Bucharest, a sleek functionalist building that was the architectural opposite of the romantic castles of her youth. It was a home built not for show but for private, orderly living. During these years, the ice around her seemed to thaw, if only slightly. A new figure entered her life, a suave and attentive banker named Alexandru Scavani, a man whom she appointed as her chamberlain and financial advisor. He was a constant presence at her side. With Scavani, Elisabeth was seen to smile, to engage in quiet conversation. Some have speculated that this was the one brief period of warmth and genuine human companionship in her lonely adult life. Whether he was a lover, a friend, or simply a trusted confidant, he seemed to provide a measure of the quiet understanding and acceptance she had always craved. She was building a life for herself, a small, controlled, and private world on her own terms. But this fragile peace was destined to be tragically short-lived. A far greater and more brutal storm was gathering over Europe, a political cataclysm that would not only destroy nations, but would also rob Elisabeth of this final sanctuary, forcing her out into the cold for the last and final time. Of course, here is the final expanded chapter of Elisabeth's story. I have built upon the existing text to add more depth, detail, and emotional resonance to her last years, creating a comprehensive conclusion to the narrative while adhering to all of your stylistic and content requirements. The Second World War and its devastating aftermath brought about the final brutal dismantling of Elisabeth's precarious world. The fragile peace she had constructed for herself in the 1930s was built on the shifting sands of European politics, and the earthquake was coming. Romania, under the dictatorial rule of Marshal Ion Antonescu, made the fateful decision to ally itself with Nazi Germany. This choice would have catastrophic consequences. After the tide of the war turned, the country was invaded by the Soviet Red Army. In 1944, a courageous coup, led by Elisabeth's young nephew, King Michael I, overthrew Antonescu and switched Romania's allegiance to the Allied side. But it was too late. The country was now firmly under the heel of Soviet occupation. For 3 years, the monarchy clung to a precarious existence, a lonely island of tradition in a sea of rising communist power. This period was not a quiet wait, but a slow-motion nightmare. For Elisabeth, living in her Bucharest palace, it was an atmosphere of palpable fear. Friends and associates from the old aristocratic and political classes began to disappear in the night. The secret police were a constant, menacing presence. Her companion, the banker Alexandru Scavani, as a prominent capitalist, would have been an immediate target for the new regime. He vanished from her life, likely arrested or forced to flee, severing her last real human connection and leaving her utterly alone to face what was coming. The end came in December of 1947. King Michael was summoned to the palace, the very Elisabeth palace that was his aunt's former residence, and was forced at gunpoint by the communist prime minister to sign a document of abdication. The Romanian monarchy, which had been created just over 80 years earlier, was abolished with the scratch of a pen. For the second time in her life, Elisabeth was stripped of her home, her status, and her identity. At the age of 53, she was forced into exile once again, this time from the homeland to which she had always, however ambivalently, retreated. This time was different and infinitely worse. The first exile had been a dynastic failure. This was a complete annihilation of her entire world. The communist officials were cold and efficient. They arrived at her palace, their faces devoid of emotion, and informed her she had days to pack a few suitcases. They walked through her rooms, making inventories of her paintings, her furniture, her jewelry, all of it, now the property of the state. The humiliation was absolute. What does one pack when one is losing an entire world? A few photograph albums, a small piece of jewelry with sentimental value, clothes for a future that was a complete and terrifying blank. She was a refugee once more, but this time she was utterly and completely alone. Her formidable mother, Queen Marie, was long dead. Her ex-husband, King George, had died in Greece earlier that same year. Her siblings were now scattered across the globe, each struggling to piece together their own shattered lives in exile. She had no husband, no children, and no country to call her own. She traveled first to Switzerland, a traditional haven for displaced royalty, but eventually settled in the south of France, in the sun-drenched, glamorous resort town of Cannes. With what little funds she had managed to take with her, she purchased a modest villa, which she named Villa Rose Alba. It was here, amidst the palm trees and the azure waters of the Mediterranean, a world famous as a playground for the wealthy, the famous, and the carefree, that she would live out the final tragic chapter of her life. Elisabeth took no part in the glittering social world of Cannes. She became a virtual recluse, her villa a fortress against a world that she felt had betrayed and abandoned her at every turn. The villa itself seemed to reflect her state of mind. Its shutters were often drawn tight against the brilliant Mediterranean sun, plunging the rooms into a perpetual twilight. Her days fell into a monotonous, solitary routine. She would wake late, take a simple meal alone in a dining room meant for a dozen guests, and spend hours sitting in a darkened salon, staring at the few family portraits she had managed to save. Sometimes the sound of her piano would drift from the house. The same melancholy Chopin pieces played over and over, the music a perfect expression of her sorrow. Her final years were a slow, inexorable descent into a deep and bitter loneliness. The cold, withdrawn girl of Pelish Castle had become a lonely, embittered old woman on the French Riviera. Having alienated most of her remaining family with her difficult and demanding personality, she had few visitors. Her younger sister, Ileana, once tried to visit, hoping to offer some comfort, but was met with a barrage of bitter accusations and grievances about past slights, real and imagined. The visit was cut short, the gulf between the sisters now unbridgeable. Elisabeth was pushing away the last people who might have saved her from herself. She was haunted by the ghosts of her past, the emotionally distant mother she could never please, the failure of her marriage, the humiliating loss of her Greek crown, the two exiles that had bookended her life. The natural reserve of her youth curdled into a deep-seated paranoia and a profound suspicion of others. She became convinced her small staff was stealing from her. A misplaced silver spoon or a missing handkerchief could trigger a furious interrogation, her eyes burning with a wild, accusatory light. The staff, a mixture of pity and fear, walked on eggshells around her. She became obsessively possessive of her few remaining belongings, a sad and pathetic echo of a life that had once been filled with the priceless treasures of a kingdom. Her health, both physical and mental, began to deteriorate rapidly. She suffered from chronic insomnia and a host of stress-related ailments. She ate little, and her already slender frame became gaunt. The clinical depression that had been a constant, shadowy companion throughout her life now consumed her completely. She was a forgotten figure, a relic from a bygone era, a lonely old princess living out her days in the faded glamour of a resort town. The vibrant, ambitious, sunlit world of her mother, Queen Marie, now seemed like a story from another planet, an impossible dream. On the 14th of November 1956, Princess Elisabeth of Romania, the former Queen of the Hellenes, died alone in her villa in Cannes. She was 62 years old. Her death was as quiet, as solitary, and as unnoticed as her life had been for decades. While the official cause of death was not widely publicized, it was widely rumored and universally believed within European royal circles that she had taken her own life. The story that circulated among her family was that she had finally succumbed to the despair that had been her lifelong tormentor and had died from a deliberate overdose of sleeping pills. It was a final desperate act to silence the pain of a lifetime of profound and unrelenting unhappiness. Whether it was a conscious act of suicide or a final, weary surrender of a body and spirit worn down by decades of sorrow, the end result was the same. Her life had ended in darkness and solitude. Her passing went largely unremarked upon by the wider world. A few brief obituaries appeared in the international press, mentioning her as the former Queen of Greece, the aunt of the deposed King of Romania. She was a footnote in the grand, chaotic history of the 20th century. Her funeral was a desperately sad affair. There were no state delegations, no honor guards. Just a handful of people, her brother Nicky, a few loyal retainers, gathered at a small church in Cannes to say goodbye. She was laid to rest in a modest grave in a local cemetery, a world away from the royal crypts of her homeland. Her simple tombstone bore her name and title, a solitary queen buried in foreign soil, a final poignant symbol of her lifelong state of exile. So what is the ultimate legacy of a woman like Elisabeth? She left behind no great political achievements, no celebrated charitable institutions that bear her name, no line of heirs to carry on her story. She is not remembered as a great beauty who charmed a nation, nor as a heroic queen who led her people through a time of crisis. By all the traditional public metrics of royal success, her life was a profound and unequivocal failure. Her story is one of quiet, persistent, and unrelenting sorrow, a life that began with the immense promise of a European princess and ended in the deepest obscurity and loneliness of a private citizen. It would be easy to dismiss her as a historical footnote, a cold and difficult woman who was simply unequal to the challenges of her position. But to do so would be to miss the deeper, more universal and far more poignant truth of her existence. Perhaps her true legacy lies not in what she did, but in what she represented. Elisabeth's story is a stark, powerful, and deeply unsettling reminder that royal lives are not the stuff of fairy tales. They are subject to the same human frailties, the same psychological struggles, the same crippling anxieties, and the same deep-seated unhappiness that can affect any one of us, regardless of our station in life. Her life was a tragic testament to the brutal reality that being born into a palace does not guarantee a happy existence, and that a crown can be the heaviest and most torturous of burdens for a head not suited to wear it. She was at her core a woman whose innate personality was in direct and constant conflict with her destiny. In another life, born into different circumstances, she might have found a quiet contentment. As a private citizen, she could have been a talented artist, a dedicated musician, or a reclusive scholar. A life lived on her own quiet, contemplative terms. Instead, she was thrust onto a brilliantly lit stage for which she had no talent and no desire, forced to play a part that was alien to her very nature. Her coldness, her aloofness, her famous difficulty may not have been simple arrogance or snobbery. It may, in fact, have been a desperate, lifelong, and ultimately inadequate defense mechanism. The only way a painfully introverted, pathologically sensitive, and deeply unhappy woman knew how to protect herself from a world that constantly demanded a performance she was psychologically incapable of giving. Her story forces us to look beyond the grand official portraits and the dry, factual histories. When we look at the photographs of Elisabeth, particularly from her time as Queen of Greece, we see more than just a beautiful, unsmiling woman in a tiara. We see the profound human cost of a system that so often prioritizes dynastic strategy and political necessity over individual happiness and psychological well-being. She is a symbol of the unseen emotional casualties of history, the ones who did not thrive in the spotlight, who did not overcome their demons, but who simply endured their suffering in silence until they could endure it no more. The legacy of Princess Elisabeth of Romania is therefore a quiet but essential one. It is a cautionary tale about the immense, often crushing pressure placed upon those born into the unforgiving glare of the public eye. It is a deeply human story about the devastating, lifelong impact of loneliness and of a profound, perhaps clinical depression in an era when such things were not understood but were simply seen as character flaws. She was the forgotten queen, the sad princess, the ghost at the magnificent feast of 20th century royalty. And in remembering her solitary, sorrowful life, we are reminded of a vital and compassionate lesson: to always look for the real person behind the public title, the fragile heart behind the glittering jewels, and the silent, often painful, and deeply human story that is waiting to be told.